Okay, so first we'll talk in our discussion of three schools of feminist thought. First we'll talk about liberal feminism. Liberal feminism as a mindset kind of matches up with the first wave. That is the women who sought to remove official discrimination, who sought voting rights, etc. And so this school of thought emphasizes the notion that women are not women first, but that they're humans first. This is a universalist, humanist approach to looking at things. A pretty clear equivalent here is Martin Luther King's approach of not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. Liberal feminists want to be judged as people, want to be put on a level playing field with men, want to be admitted to the system and treated quite simply as equals, right? Equality is the key, and there's a de-emphasis in liberal feminism on the differences between men and women, especially the biological differences. To say, look, it doesn't matter that we bear children, you don't, or that you're stronger and we're weaker or whatever. We want the same rights. We're universal, and as universal as humanist approach to things, right? Liberal feminists then, again, as a great example of the voting situation, seek to join the existing system, work within it to create change, right? Women say, look, we would like into democracy in America, so let us vote. Once we get a vote, then we'll get into that system and we'll work with inside the democratic system to create change. Pretty straightforward idea, right? Very palatable to a broad audience. People are obviously, we can all say, all right, I'm on board with liberal feminism. We see the impact of liberal feminism in the theater in a lot of really straightforward ways. Generally speaking, liberal feminists tend to write and think in a traditional or realistic style. Or theater that reflects the liberal feminist ideas tends to be in a more traditional realistic style. Tends to focus on, in the canon, right, all the plays we read and consider great plays, inclusion of works by, for, and about women. Two specific examples of how liberal feminism would appear or impact the theater. Trifles, check, right? Susan Glaspell takes the realistic, naturalistic tendencies and styles created by, right, Shaw, Chekhov, Ibsen, Strindberg, and all the others and says, you know what? We need some works in this style that are by, for, and about women. There we get trifles, very clearly, right? By and large, liberal feminists seek to include themselves, right, in the canon, in the existing society, and say, we would like to be included as well. Let's not think so much about how we're different, but if you give us a level playing field and allow us to participate in male activities, compete with men on a level playing field, we'll do just fine, thank you. So, here are my 2 points of discussion. Carol Churchill, as a playwright, and anyone in their right mind, looks at liberal feminism and says, yep, there's a lot of good here. Liberal feminist and a liberal feminist mindset changes the world, right? So where in the play do you see the accomplishments and the sort of praises of a liberal feminist mindset? Where in the play do we see women succeeding on a level playing field? Where do we see women de-emphasizing biological differences and not focusing on, oh, well, you're a woman or whatever, right? Where in the play do we see a very liberal feministic approach of saying, look, even in this world, we still have all these problems with sexism? And then also, Churchill is going to go ahead and criticize liberal feminism as well. And we'll talk about different modes or mindsets we might use to critique liberal feminism. But Churchill certainly has some places in the play where she says, not directly, but she says, universalist approach to men and women is good, but it also has some problems in a couple of different ways. So take a look for those two things. Then we move forward to the second wave of feminism, and we get a very different approach to what it means to be a feminist, a cultural radical feminist mindset. Again, we're talking about America in America, England, and Europe to some degree, right in the 1960s and 70s especially. So we're tracking onto that second wave of feminism. The cultural radical feminists come along in the 60s and 70s and say, hey, liberal feminists, like, good job. But what you really did is you just said, hey, women, you should act like men. And they looked around and said, how do men act? Competitive, violent, selfish, egotistical. I'm not going to go back and delete that because that's really funny. Egotistical. And, right, we've got this idea that just like Malcolm X and the Black Power movement said to Martin Luther King, hey, Martin Luther King, you want to be included in the system? By being included in the system, you are leaving some of your essential blackness behind. The cultural radical feminists said, hey, liberal feminists, You want the vote, you want to be in Congress, you want to participate in this democratic system, you want to be not seen as different in terms of gender and sex, you're leaving something behind. Instead, what the cultural radical feminists want to do is embrace essential female traits. What do they say are essential female traits? Women everywhere bear children. Therefore, they are more respectful of life. They have mothering instincts. Women are more in touch with their emotions. Men are not. Women are more conversational and collaborative and diplomatic and group-oriented. Men are not. And we look at the individualism of male behavior and the collaborative nature of female behavior. That's what the cultural radical feminists are really doing. They're embracing these frequently biologically based, right? Because a lot of this comes down to mothering and the ability to bear children, and saying, look, this is actually good. The conclusion then is women are not universal and not just humans. They are in fact different. And in many cases, a cultural radical feminist will argue that women are superior. Here's one good example of this. If we take a look at the way pretty much every society in pretty much all of human history has been run, it's been run by patriarchy, right? Men have ruled either as kings or as presidents or as emperors or as legislators or whatever you want to say. Men have been running the show. And cultural radical feminists take a look at the history of society. Say, men have been running the show. Okay, let's see what characterizes the history of society. War, famine, genocide, rape, murder, injustice based on race, injustice based on gender, competition to the point of violence. These are the characteristics of society. These characteristics come from patriarchy. If women had been ruling the world for thousands of years, go back up 2 bullet points, the world would have been more mothering, more emotional, more conversational, more collaborative, more diplomatic. Maybe, say the cultural radical feminists, if you're a mother, you are less likely to start a war because you know it's going to be your children that you bore who are going to go off and die in that war. That's the cultural radical feminist argument here. The conclusion then is the system is fundamentally broken because it's a patriarchal system. Instead of joining in the patriarchal system, which is hierarchical and structured and organized, and you have a leader who's in charge and follows orders and all this very male stuff, cultural radical feminists say, nope, we're going to create a new one. And in the most radical version of cultural radical feminists, you get feminist collectives who in the 1960s and 70s go off and live as a society with just women. And they say, we're going to be collaborative. There's a clear tie to a communal or communistic approach to life here, right? Collaborative, democratic, hyper-equality oriented. And the conclusion is you get that separatist attitude. Again, women are not just equals. We're not going to de-emphasize our biology here. We're actually going to emphasize it. Note that our biology makes us superior. We get plenty of interesting cultural radical feminist theater. What you get is, number one, a departure from those described by cultural radical feminists, male modes of storytelling. Men are linear, they are literal, they are logical, they are playwright dominated, right? There's almost an authoritarian nature, says a radical feminist, to a lot of male ways of storytelling. The playwright and the director's voice is dominant. Everybody follows their orders. We take a nice linear or literal, logical, realistic approach to storytelling. Radical feminists say that is inherently unfemale, and we got to get away from that. Instead, we have to tell stories that embrace emotion rather than logic, that speak in terms of anti-realistic abstraction rather than literal A, B, C, D, E, straightforward stuff, right? For instance, a radical feminist would look at Susan Glaspell's Trifles and say, well, good job, Susan, you're telling female stories, but you're doing it in a male way. Yeah, okay, you kind of subverted the detective story structure, but basically this is just a plain old linear structure, realism. You're just basically telling a female story using male language. The argument from a radical feminist is there is an inherently female language and inherently female way of telling stories, and we've got to tell stories that way. So radical feminist plays tend to be super abstract, super circular, almost poetic, and very unliteral in terms of being able to understand the story in a logical, rational way. One of the other things we get is radical feminism sees the development of numerous lesbian theater collectives. That is, women who say, we don't have a playwright. We're going to form a theater company. We don't have a director. We don't have an authority. We're going to get together and in an improvisational collaborative format create some of these kinds of storytelling. And there's a clear parallel between numerous lesbian theater collectives in the 1960s, 70s in America and a lot of these mindsets, which say, again, women are inherently not just different, but superior in many ways. So, we see the notions of cultural radical feminism in this play, both in terms of style and agenda. So take a look at those male ways of storytelling. How is this play not linear, not literal, not logical? Where does this play embrace things like emotion abstraction, circularity, and anti-realistic techniques? And then go back up to the top here and say, where does this play consider embracing some of these essential female traits? Where does it embrace the notion of motherhood? Or where does it criticize a character for denying the responsibilities of motherhood? That's another radical feminist mentality. Where, for example, does this play say to a liberal feministic mindset, you just want women to act like men? Where does it show us women who, yeah, you got a lot going on here, you've accomplished a whole lot, but really all you're doing is acting like a man, competitive, violent, selfish, egotistical, right? So put on your radical feminist hat and take a look at this play. And then, what comments or criticisms might Churchill have regarding radical feminism? Because she's not a radical feminist. She certainly recognizes the accomplishments and the points of radical feminism, but she also says, let's take a look at this notion that all women are inherently mothering, emotional, conversational, collaborative, diplomatic, group-oriented. Churchill says, really, radical feminist? All women are like that? Are you sure? Find me some examples of both of those things. And our final stopping point is the extraordinarily long-named materialist or Marxist/socialist feminism. We can call these materialist feminists for short. Materialist feminists match up to some degree with a third wave of feminism. Historically, they come about at the same time. And as I mentioned with the third wave, there's a sort of fracturing of the feminist agenda in the third wave. Different people with different goals and aims for what feminism is. Materialist feminist creates its own particular goal that doesn't line up with all the other goals of feminism. So the materialist feminists take a look and say, hey, liberal feminists, this notion of equality is really problematic, right? Oh, really, women, you just want in the door and to be treated as equals? Well, okay, what door are you getting in? What system are you joining? The materialist feminist mindset has some critiques of what the liberals believe. It also has some some criticisms of this notion that the radical feminists have of universality. A materialist feminist would say to a radical feminist, well, really, there's female universality? Like all women really have the same traits and want the same things? Isn't that really kind of problematic? Aren't we just judging people by their biology again, which is how this all got started? Instead, a materialist feminist says, and this is where they line up with the liberals, we want to de-emphasize the biological differences. Rather than embrace them like the radicals do, we want to de-emphasize them. And instead, we want to question the universality of the female experience. Not all women have the same experience. And one of the ways in which we do that is to focus on those societal constructs of gender, how are women gendered, and the economic conditions and results of those constructs. So it's less important for me to think about like, well, all women have the ability to be mothers and therefore there's this essential quality. Instead to say, how are women gendered? How do we teach women to be women? In all these different millions of ways that we all know about, right? And then more importantly is, because we're talking about a Marxist approach, what are the economic results of those constructs? My Marxist, if anytime you put on that Marxist hat, you start looking for the dollar signs and you look around the world. One of the first things the dollar signs will tell you is women have been oppressed economically since the beginning of time. They have not been given control over money. They make less money for the same work. They don't have significant financial independence, broadly speaking, et cetera, et cetera. So we want to focus on that. The other aspect that materialist feminists want to do is to say, I don't think that, for instance, working class women and upper class women have the same feminist goals. In fact, by and large, upper-class women, yeah, they might have some feminist goals, but really they want the societal structure to stay the same. Working-class women who are right, have financial problems and challenges, they want the society to be different and things to be changed. Class and politics, therefore, are frequently more important than gender. There's a really key argument between Marlene and Joyce in this play where we see that, yep, just because you're a woman doesn't mean you agree on class and doesn't mean you agree on politics. That finance is more important than being a woman. So we're really undermining a lot of this universality and equality business and simplistic notions of equality and from a materialist feminist standpoint. In materialist feminism, plays that tend to match up with this mindset tend to, in many ways, depart from traditional male storytelling, structure-wise, but also they don't go as emotional, spiritual, poetic, radical, abstract as the radical feminists. There's sort of a middle ground in materialist feminism, and one of the big things we see is the huge influence of Brecht in materialist socialist writers. Materialist feminist writers, the idea of keeping things at a critical distance, the idea of sort of alienating the audience to some degree from what's going on stage in a pure radical emotional storytelling conceit, the idea of complicating identity by cross-casting, things like that, right? So where do you see these notions of materialist feminism executed in the play? Where does Churchill come along and say, hey, women, unity is a lot more complicated than you think. Let's take a look at the relationship between gender and social class. And where does she talk about those intersections between those two things? And then, obviously, show me some Brechtian techniques in this play. Show me where we see different aspects of Brecht's modes of storytelling emphasized and repeated by Churchill. So those are our three schools of thought. Thanks.